In 1492, a lost Italian sailor, thinking he had reached Asia instead, stumbled onto a continent that would one day become the most powerful nation on Earth. What followed was 5 centuries of exploration, colonization, slavery, revolution, and reinvention. This is the story of how America began, and how it fought, bled, and argued its way into existence. On October 12th, 1492, Christopher Columbus and his crew, aboard 3 small ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, made landfall on an island in the Caribbean. Columbus, sailing under the Spanish crown, believed he had found a new route to Asia. He hadn't. He had found something far more significant, a vast, largely uncharted world that Europeans had no idea existed. Columbus never actually set foot on what is now the continental United States, but his voyages cracked open the door. Within decades, Spanish explorers were pushing north from the Caribbean and Mexico into Florida and the American Southwest. In 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon became the first European known to reach Florida. In 1540, Hernando de Soto led an expedition deep into the interior of North America, crossing rivers, mountains, and plains that no European had ever seen. But the land was not empty. Tens of millions of indigenous people had been living across North America for thousands of years. Complex societies with their own governments, trade networks, languages, and cultures. The arrival of Europeans was, for them, not a discovery. It was the beginning of a catastrophe. Disease alone, smallpox, measles, influenza, wiped out an estimated 90% of the indigenous population within a century of contact. Entire civilizations vanished before most Europeans even knew they existed. The English arrived later than the Spanish, but they came to stay. In 1607, a group of English settlers established Jamestown in what is now Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in North America. It nearly failed immediately. Disease, starvation, and conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy killed most of the settlers in the first years. But it survived, and it set a pattern. In 1620, a group of religious separatists, the Pilgrims, crossed the Atlantic aboard the Mayflower and landed at Plymouth in present-day Massachusetts. They came seeking religious freedom, and before they even stepped off the ship, they signed the Mayflower Compact, a simple agreement to govern themselves by the consent of the group. It was a small document, but it planted a seed. The idea that government derived its authority from the people, not from a king, would grow slowly over the next century and a half until it exploded into revolution. Through the 1600s and early 1700s, 13 English colonies stretched along the eastern seaboard of North America, from Massachusetts in the north to Georgia in the south. Each had its own character. New England colonies were built around trade, fishing, and tight Puritan communities. The middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, were more diverse, more commercial. The southern colonies, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, were built on agriculture and increasingly on the labor of enslaved Africans. The slave trade was one of the darkest foundations of colonial America. By the mid-1700s, roughly 500,000 enslaved people lived in the colonies, mostly in the South, working tobacco and rice plantations under brutal conditions. The economy of the colonies was built, in no small part, on their suffering. This contradiction, a society that would eventually declare all men equal while holding hundreds of thousands in chains, would define and haunt American history for centuries to come. By the 1760s, tensions between the American colonies and the British Crown had been building for years. The colonies had grown prosperous and increasingly self-reliant. They had their own assemblies, their own traditions of local governance, their own sense of identity. And then Britain, deep in debt from the 7 Years' War, decided the colonies should help pay for it. In 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, a direct tax on printed materials in the colonies. The reaction was immediate and furious. Colonists argued that they could not be taxed by a parliament in which they had no representation. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry. The Stamp Act was eventually repealed, but Parliament kept pushing. The Townshend Act taxed paper, glass and tea. British troops were stationed in Boston. Tensions mounted. On March 5, 1770, a confrontation between colonists and British soldiers in Boston spiraled into gunfire. 5 colonists were killed. It was called the Boston Massacre. And though the incident was messy and complicated, it became a powerful piece of propaganda, proof to many colonists that Britain intended to rule by force. 3 years later came the Boston Tea Party. In December 1773, a group of colonists, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water, a direct protest against British taxation. Britain responded with the coercive acts, closing Boston Harbor and restricting colonial self-governance. The colonies called them the Intolerable Acts, and they responded by coming together. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They agreed to boycott British goods and petitioned the king for their rights. The king ignored them. By the spring of 1775, the situation had crossed the point of no return. On April 19, 1775, British troops marched toward Concord, Massachusetts, to seize colonial weapons. At Lexington, they encountered a small militia. Shots were fired. No one knows who fired first, and 8 colonists were killed. It was the shot heard round the world. The American Revolutionary War had begun. The early months of the war were chaotic. The colonial militias were poorly equipped, undertrained, and up against the most powerful military in the world. In June 1775, the Second Continental Congress appointed George Washington, a Virginia planter and veteran soldier, as commander of the Continental Army. Washington was not a brilliant tactician, but he had something rarer: the ability to hold an army together through years of cold, hunger, defeat, and despair. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson. Its opening words were revolutionary in the most literal sense, a declaration not just of political separation, but of a new philosophy of human rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was one of the most consequential sentences ever written. The war itself dragged on for 8 more years. Washington's army suffered devastating losses. At Brooklyn, at Brandywine, at Germantown. The winter at Valley Forge in 1777 to 1778 nearly destroyed the Continental Army. Soldiers starved, froze, and deserted. Washington held on. The turning point came at the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777, where American forces under General Horatio Gates defeated a British army and captured over 6,000 soldiers. It was the first major American victory, and it convinced France to enter the war on the American side. French money, troops, and naval power fundamentally changed the balance. Spain and the Netherlands also entered the conflict against Britain. In October 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis surrendered his army at Yorktown, Virginia, effectively ending the war. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, formally recognized the United States of America as an independent nation. 13 colonies had become a country, but winning independence was only the beginning. The new nation now had to figure out how to govern itself. The first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, created a central government so weak it could barely function. It had no power to tax, no power to regulate commerce, and no real authority over the states. By 1786, it was clearly not working. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia, again for the Constitutional Convention. Over a sweltering summer, they debated, argued, and compromised. The result was the United States Constitution, a document that created a federal government with 3 branches, a system of checks and balances, and a framework for governance that has lasted, with amendments, for over 2 centuries. In 1791, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, were added, guaranteeing freedoms of speech, religion, press, and protection from arbitrary government power. George Washington became the first president of the United States in 1789. He served 2 terms and then, in a move that stunned the world, voluntarily stepped down from power. In an era of kings and emperors, the peaceful transfer of power was a radical act. It set a precedent that defined American democracy for generations. But the new nation carried a deep and unresolved contradiction. The Declaration said all men were created equal. The Constitution protected the institution of slavery. Hundreds of thousands of black Americans remained enslaved while white Americans celebrated their freedom. The founders knew it was a contradiction. Many of them, including Jefferson, who owned over 600 enslaved people during his lifetime, chose not to resolve it. They passed it forward, and it would fester, grow, and eventually tear the country apart in the bloodiest war in American history, the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. But that is a story for another video. From Columbus stumbling onto Caribbean shores in 1492, to 13 colonies declaring themselves a nation in 1776, to a constitution that still governs 330 million people today, the story of America's founding is one of the most dramatic, complicated, and consequential chapters in all of human history. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more. See you in the next one.